Hello everyone out there in Blount County and beyond. My name is Melinda and I'm a reference librarian here at the Blount County Public Library in Maryville, Tennessee. Once again, I'm so pleased to welcome you back to Storytime for Grown-Ups, and I hope that you've been doing well. If you're like me, you have perhaps been watching more than your usual share of news about the events which are occurring in Eastern Europe right now. And perhaps you've also been searching online for information about Ukraine and the Ukrainian culture. I was doing that recently when I stumbled across a document which I found very interesting. It was a letter from a Ukrainian diplomat to our Secretary of State seeking U.S. support for his nation's sovereignty. It was actually written well before the events of this past month, but I found it very pertinent, and it gave historical and cultural background for the events which are occurring right now, and so I thought I would share that with you today. Just a heads up, the letter is very lengthy and detailed, so I am editing rather heavily as I read it. The letter is addressed to the Honorable, the Secretary of State, Department of State, Washington, and it begins, Sir, in view of the present status in Eastern Europe and in deference to the unsettled affairs of the territory which are now pressing for a definite solution, I conceive it to be my duty to submit for your consideration this memorandum setting forth the just claims of the Ukrainian people to political and economic independence. Ukraine's claim to independence is based upon the following principal grounds. 1. The existence of the Ukrainians as a well-defined, separate, group-conscious race with a continuous historic and cultural tradition. 2. Their occupation over a period of centuries of the lands where they now dwell. 3. Their age-long efforts, increasingly of popular origin, to achieve and maintain political independence. 4. The obvious interest and desire of the entire Ukrainian population to organize and sustain its economic life free of exploitation by neighbors and foreign powers. And 5. The crying need for a new order in Eastern Europe and the permanent elimination of the historical struggle to control the natural resources of Ukraine. In America, there has been a popular impression that Ukraine is merely a province of Russia, identified with it linguistically and racially. This is a misapprehension. In culture and temperament, Ukrainians display peculiarities which permeate their whole social and moral nature. Their language is a separate Slavic tongue and not merely a dialect of the Great Russian. Between Ukrainians and Russians, says Sir Donald Mackenzie Wallace, a learned student of Russia, there are profound differences of language, customs, traditions, domestic arrangements, mode of life, and communal organizations. I should say that we have here two distinct nationalities. The historic development, says the official statement of the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences, contributed toward the creation of two nationalities, the Great Russian and the Ukrainian. The historic life of the two peoples failed to develop a common language for them. On the contrary, it really strengthened those dialectic variances with which the ancestors of the Ukrainians on the one hand and those of the Great Russians on the other made their appearance in history. A brief survey of history shows that for more than 1,000 years, the Ukrainians and their forebears have continued to occupy approximately the same lands which they now inhabit, except for temporary recessions and recolonizations caused by Mongol invasions. In the 9th century, they were already settled in the vast and fertile plains and woodlands lying between the Carpathian Mountains and the Sea of Azov. Organized government in Ukraine began with the ancient state of Kiev. The ascendancy of Kiev also marks the period of Ukraine's greatest political expansion. From the 9th to the 13th century, Kiev was the center of economic, intellectual, and political life of Eastern Europe, uniting the entire ethnographic Ukrainian territories. The name by which this state was known was Rus, taken from the name of the reigning dynasty. The name and this term was later appropriated by the Great Russians. Because of the Byzantine commerce, learning, and craft, observes the Polish historian Zagorski, and I apologize, I'm probably mispronouncing that. Kiev, the mother of Rus cities, was for Poland of the 11th and 12th centuries what Rome had been for earlier Germans. The French geographer Reclus notices that academies flourished at Kiev and Ostrog before the Great Russians owned a single high school, and draws attention to the fact that Russia, during the regenerative period of Peter the Great, received her teachers from Ukraine. The fall of Kiev and Ukraine's subsequent loss of autonomous statehood in the 14th century can only be ascribed to the old system of military conquest. And he explains that Ukraine eventually fell a prey to Poland, to whom she was a tempting prize because of her rich soil. The Polish conquest of Ukraine started in 1340 and led to bitter warfare. And he also explains that eventually the territories fell under both Polish and Lithuanian control. In 1648, the whole Ukrainian people rose, and then, anticipating further Polish efforts to destroy the newly won independence of Ukraine and menaced by other foes, the Ukrainians concluded an agreement of confederation with the Tsar of Muscovy in 1654. It is interesting to recall that their leader was expressly advised against this step by Oliver Cromwell, who declared that the Tsar would never permanently recognize a free people. The most important clauses in the Treaty of 1654 guaranteed a freely chosen supreme head for the Ukrainian state called the Hetman, the right to engage in diplomatic relations with other states except Poland and Turkey, and other agreements. Muscovy did not live up to these terms, and the result was a succession of Ukrainian uprisings directed now against Russia, just as they had formerly been aimed at Poland. In the last quarter of the 17th century, Russia and Poland made common cause and partitioned Ukraine, leading to more rebellions by the Ukrainians. Russia's policy of repression was pursued openly and ruthlessly. In 1722, the power of the hetmans was cut down to nothing. In 1764, Catherine II abolished the office altogether. Meanwhile, in order to assure possession of Ukraine, the Russian government was making every effort to assimilate the Ukrainian people. One step toward accomplishing this was the suppression of Ukrainian literature. In 1720, a special censorship over the publication of Ukrainian books was established in Kiev. In 1769, even the printing of Ukrainian primers was forbidden, and Russian textbooks were introduced in spite of the protests of Ukrainian educators. Step by step, national feeling was stifled in Ukraine. In 1783, the peasants of Ukraine were again subjected by the Russian government to serfdom in its most cruel form. Hundreds of thousands of free peasants and Cossacks, together with millions of acres of Ukrainian land, were distributed among the favorites of Catherine II. This measure had the effect of crushing the resistance of Russification among the Ukrainian nobility and estranged them from the common people. The last quarter of the century witnessed a temporary eclipse of the Ukrainian spirit of nationalism. The French Revolution released forces that had been imprisoned in the hearts and minds of the people. A wave of nationalistic feeling swept through Europe, bringing inspiration to the Slavs as well as their Western brothers. Every branch of the Slavic race awoke to a realization of its history, its traditions, and its great men. The Ukrainians shared in this renaissance. Between the revived nationalism and the spirit of democracy, a natural alliance presently sprang up, especially in the Dnieper district, There began an enthusiastic study of the country's history and the perusal of old documents and popular traditions. The people were recognized as guardians of national culture. But the Ukrainian movement was confronted by a bitterly hostile Russophile bureaucracy. The Ukrainian language was restricted time and again. Ukrainian economic life was hampered in several ways. The Ukrainian serfs, upon their liberation in 1861, had been granted smaller allotments than the Russian serfs. This resulted in overpopulation of the agricultural districts and immigration and a high death rate. Nevertheless, the 19th century witnessed a notable growth of Ukrainian national feeling. The early years of the century constitute the period of literary rebirth. Then followed the educational work among the common people. Private schools were organized, and pamphlets and books were distributed. Cultural organizations were formed, and a pronounced interest in science was displayed. This entire revival so alarmed the Russian government that in 1878 the Tsar prohibited almost all publications in the Ukrainian language. Still, the literary impulse was not suppressed. It succeeded in winning for the Ukrainian a worthy place among Slavonic literatures. Side by side with the cultural advance, a political reawakening of the Ukrainian people was taking place. It was appreciated by the Ukrainians that political liberty for their land and race was expressly conditioned upon the overthrow of the Tsarist government. Accordingly, they bent their efforts in that direction. The events of March 1917 were largely made possible by the Ukrainian regiments stationed in Petrograd. Later on, the Ukrainians were the first of the subject nations of the Russian Empire to organize their own government. On November 20th, 1917, Ukraine was proclaimed an independent nation by the Central Rada, the Provisional Ukrainian Parliament. The expediency of Ukraine's claim to exist as a self-governing nation does not, however, rest merely upon racial, ethnological, and historical bases. There are also primary economic considerations. The territory of Ukraine is not merely abundantly self-supporting, but is in fact one of the richest areas on the Earth's surface. 4/5 of the entire extent lie within a belt of deep black earth, which produces bounteous crops of wheat, barley, rye, oats, sugar beets, fruit, tobacco, and vegetables. Under its territory lie mineral riches: coal, petroleum, iron, manganese, salt, phosphate, kaolin, graphite, and many other substances of commercial value. An enumeration of the physical resources of Ukraine shows how mistaken is the concept that Ukraine could not maintain an economic existence independent of Russia. The converse of the same proposition that Russia cannot live without Ukraine will not survive impartial criticism. And the three fundamental bases of opposition usually advanced are: Ukraine is the granary of Russia, it is necessary to Russia for a large part of her food supply, Ukraine separates Russia from the Black Sea and Sea of Azov, thereby closing the outlet to the Mediterranean, and Ukraine possesses a supply of coal and iron which is necessary to Russia. The writer responds to these objections in detail and concludes, finally, there is no obstacle to permanent economic cooperation of Ukraine and Russia and brisk commercial dealings between the two independent states. But political disentanglement is a first requisite. The richness of Ukraine has always made it a tempting region for exploitation by neighboring states. This is more true than ever today. If such exploitation is not to be carried on at the expense of and to the detriment of the Ukrainian people, a separate state organization is necessary to assume protection over their economic interests. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that a free Ukraine does not imply an economically isolated Ukraine. Constant traffic with friendly foreign powers is desired by all the Ukrainian political parties. Inability to contest the force of the foregoing historic and economic considerations has led certain foes of Ukrainian independence to make the assertion that the Ukrainian national movement is artificially stimulated and does not receive support from the masses of the population. This contention is controverted by the most obvious facts. The Ukrainians have been actively fighting for their liberty in spite of almost incredible obstacles. They have had no support from any foreign source in this struggle. They did not give up because they realized that the question was one of life or death. No other nation in modern times has fought for its independence under such difficult circumstances, and none has expressed its desire for freedom more strongly. The plebiscite of blood is the most sincere evidence of the will to self-determination. However, prolonged and stubborn fighting has not been the only way in which the Ukrainian people have shown their desire to be free. They have had several opportunities to manifest their wish in a more peaceful and regular manner. Thus, the Central Rada, which represented all classes of Ukrainians and included in addition representatives of the various non-Ukrainian nationalities in the land, proclaimed Ukraine's independence in 1917. In 1918, even the Ukrainian communists declared themselves in favor of a free Ukraine and protested to the Russian Soviet government against its proposed invasion. Their protest went unheeded, and when the Russian Bolsheviki occupied Kyiv and endeavored to impose their system upon Ukraine, they found no Ukrainians who were willing to cooperate with them. The result was the so-called Ukrainian Soviet government, which is in reality anything but Ukrainian. It is noteworthy that the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which I have the honor to represent, is the only government which the Ukrainian people have been willing to support. On the other hand, they have revolted against all foreign invaders who have attempted to impose their own rule upon the Ukrainians. At the present moment, the recognition of the Ukrainian People's Republic is a matter of international expediency because there can be no peace in Eastern Europe as long as Ukraine is subjected to any neighboring nation. The relegation of all Ukraine to Russia would mean at best the arbitrary compulsion of the Ukrainians to a federation which, if advisable, should come at their own instance and of their own free will, not because of outside pressure. At worst, it would renew their servitude. An independent Ukrainian state would establish a balance of power in Eastern Europe, which must be regarded as the surest guarantee of peace in that portion of the world. The foregoing statement covers in outline form the main grounds upon which Ukraine bases her claim to independence. This memorandum is presented to you, Mr. Secretary, in the hope that the Ukrainian situation will be thoroughly examined, and it is my earnest belief that a careful study of Ukrainian affairs will sustain the request for recognition of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which I have the honor herewith to submit. I am, my dear sir, your very obedient servant, Julian Batchinsky, diplomatic representative of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Mr. Batchinsky's letter is dated May 12, 1920, a year and a half after the close of World War I, the war that was to end all wars. Of course, from our perspective in history, we can know that in 1922, Ukraine became a republic of the Soviet Union. Then in 1991, the nation's parliament declared Ukraine to be an independent country. And now we watch as history unfolds once more. Julian Batchinsky's letter was published as a pamphlet in 1920 by an organization called Friends of Ukraine. It is entitled Memorandum to the Government of the United States on the Recognition of the Ukrainian People's Republic. If you would like to read it in its entirety, it is accessible in digitized format on several websites, and we would be happy to help you locate those. Also, if you'd like just more general information about Ukraine and its culture, we do have a display which my colleague created of resources related to Ukraine. And of course, we would be happy if you'd like to come into the library with your questions, or give us a call at 865-982-0981, or visit our website at www.blountlibrary.org. Thank you once again so much for joining us for Storytime for Grown-Ups. It is an honor to be with you.